Welcome everyone. My name is Jody King and I am Contract Specialist with the Alaska Apex Accelerator. And this morning we're going to be talking about contract closeout, which is that final step of successful project completion and contract administration. And just as a reminder, since this is a recorded webinar, if you do have an open mic, just keep in mind that it is recorded. All right, give me one more moment and then we'll get started. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the contract closeout procedures, record retention requirements, reviewing costs is, truly the final payment and the importance of that term final. And we're going to talk about rolling up past performance reporting and reviews. So let's start with the definition. So closeout is a wrap-up of a completed contract involving the review of the contract file, the taking of necessary action to close the file, and disposal of the file. So that is the entirety of that closeout process. And as you can see in the purple text, it can begin when the contract has been physically completed. And we can see there from FAR 4.804-5 that that is the trigger for the closeout process to begin. As soon as the job has been completed, the task has been done, the supplies delivered, that physically complete, then the administrative process of closing out a contract can begin. And we can see here quite a few bullets of all the things that need to be started when we're doing that administrative review of our contract process. These are part of the things that are going to begin to happen. And I'm not going to talk about all of it again because this covers a lot of things, but I just want to pull our attention to a few things. Grab my laser point. So disposition of classified materials, property clearance report is received, any price revision is completed. So when we talk about price revision, any of the change order documentation, any of that request for equitable adjustment, subcontracts are settled by the prime contractor, and in some cases, federal agencies might even ask for documentation to the effect that there are no subcontractor liens on the contract. And then contractor closing statement has been completed, that final invoice has been submitted, and last, that contract funds review is completed and excess funds deobligated. So when we think about the completion of the contract, these are all these final bit of administrative pieces. The one thing I want to kind of point out when it comes to these final invoices and contract fund review, this is something that should also be done at the end of those option years, not necessarily at the end of the completion of the entirety of a contract. So if you have a multiple year contract, you should be kind of taking a check and using this as, what does this option year look like, especially when it comes to any of change orders or REAs, those requests for equitable adjustments, anything that funding, subcontractor payments, you want to make sure that each option year you have that paperwork complete. Because if you're looking at doing all of this after the completion of a 5-year contract, it might be harder to find all those necessary documents to ensure that you have a complete contract file and all of the data needed to prove the performance, so that when you are settling up that final invoice, you don't want to have to go back and search for anything that you might need as supporting document. All right. So on this last comment here, the final invoice has been submitted. When you are submitting invoices through an electronic platform such as IPP or wide area workflow, there is an actual toggle where it's asking you, is this a final invoice? And you have to be careful and make sure that you are not saying, yes, it is a final invoice if it is not, because in some cases, especially in wide area workflow, that's closing the contract payment process, that you've triggered the final. And if that's not the case, you have to get assistance for them to then say, well, no, it wasn't the final, we made an error. So now, one more invoice. So be careful of that when you are submitting those invoices on that electronic process, that you are paying attention to whether it truly is a final invoice or not when you are submitting that, especially if you have a contract where you have progress payment options. And when we talk about that last step, this last bullet, the contract funds reviews completed, excess funds deobligated. So this is where you should be looking at your own accounting system, one, to make sure that there has been no excess payments, that you haven't been overpaid, underpaid, and looking at, is there truly excess funds on the contract that should be deobligated? Now, keep in mind, again, in that world of option years, you may have excess funds on an option year, and then the new option year is being awarded with those additional funds. You want to talk to the contracting officer on that. In that case, if you do have excess funds on the option year, how do they want you to burn through that? Because these funds have all the fiscal legal requirements that they're 1 year money, sometimes once that next year's funds have been obligated, you are no longer supposed to be spending against last year's funds. So that kind of depends on the agency. It depends on the color of the money, so to speak, on if that's multi-year, if it's okay to keep burning that down, or if once those new funds, you're supposed to switch. So just kind of something to keep in mind when we're talking about that invoicing process. All right. So physical completion. So again, contract closeout can only be performed on contracts that are physically complete. So again, required completion of required delivery, all supplies have been inspected and accepted, and that part is critical as well. All services have been performed and accepted. All option provisions, if any, have expired, or the government has given a contractor a complete contract termination, or the contract period has expired. So just again, a definition of that physical completion. And then the exception for contract closeout, a contract file cannot be closed if it's under litigation or under appeal, or if there is a termination process in place. Timelines. So we're not going to go over a lot of these, but the two that we're going to pull out, under simplified acquisition procedures, it's considered closed when the contracting officer receives evidence of receipt of property. So any government held property plus any of the deliverables that were itemized on the contract, and final payment, of course, unless it's specified for specific agencies. There's always that unless or exception for the rule, it seems. For fixed price contracts, that contract closeout, the contract should be closed out within 6 months after receipt. And then, of course, with cost reimbursement, we're looking at a 36-month window of when it should be completed. And in this case, what they're allowing for is that final audit and evaluation of indirect costs to be determined and approved for that actual cost reimbursement. So accelerated closeout. I'm going to kind of leave this for you. This really kind of falls into place, the quick closeout procedures, and it's applicable for contracts that are cost reimbursement. And so in a nutshell, what it allows is, instead of us having, this 36-month window to wait when we're dealing with cost reimbursement, and again, that's when the contractor is going to have that, might have a DCMA audit or a third-party audit come in to verify that those indirect costs are accurate and complete. All of that takes time, and of course that fiscal year has to be completed before that can begin anyway. So we have that duration. So the concept of the quick contract closeout is to have a negotiated discussion on the indirect costs under the contract, and then agree that, well, based on these years, we're going to go ahead and just claim, and we're going to agree that we will settle for this indirect cost rate so that that final invoice that includes those actual costs are then captured and closed out. So this slide kind of talks about all the things that we need to look at for this quick closeout procedure. But when we talk about, as we can see, oops, I went too many far, simplified contracts under simplified acquisition or fixed price contracts, these by nature of the contract are easier to close out and have a quicker timeline. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about accelerated closeout. If you by chance are in the circumstance where you have multiple contracts or you're in that cost reimbursement contract world, you're more than welcome to schedule an appointment and we can talk more about this specifically for any contracts that you may have. So again, it just talks about the process and procedure. So there's the two slides, and this last talks about there's two different methods you can use to determine that negotiated indirect rate to be able to close out that final invoice. All right, sorry about that. We're going to have a few sections where I'm going to kind of have to go through it very quickly to make sure we stay within our time limit. All right, let's talk about who should be involved in the contract closeout process. So this information has kind of that, what the agency needs to provide and who should be involved from the agency side. And then we have mirrored on the right for the contractor. So when we are looking at it, and so if, I'm talking to office administrators or those contract compliance folks that are responsible for that contract closeout, although the brunt of the work may fall on that individual, there are other parties that we are needing to reach out to make sure that we have all of the documentation and have truly closed out and received all of the final information to be able to do that final invoice to make sure that we can go ahead and close that contract and move on to our next project. So you can see here list, of course, the contract administrator, the CFO, auditor, property administrator, security clearance administrator, if that was applicable, project manager, because that's who's going to have that day-to-day relationship with your contracting officer representative or the contracting officer technical representative, cost estimator, marketing professional, for this past performance, legal counsel, and of course your subcontractors and any other teaming departments, because you might need documentation from them as well. And you can see we kind of have that similar over on the agency side. And if you're the individual currently shaking your head saying, yeah, those are all me, you have my empathy. There's that joy of wearing multiple hats. But it's really meant to kind of take a look at not only the parties involved, but the information that you might need to go ahead from those parties to go ahead and start that contract closeout process. So completed contract files. So the contract documentation is generally defined as those written records of individual activities that have taken place under the contract. Well, currently, so much of our day-to-day contract documentation is electronic. So this is where we want to kind of take a look at all of the documentation that traditionally would be paper written and make sure that you have those electronic supporting documents. When we start to talk about the timeline that you have, how long do you have to maintain the files? How long does it need to be accessible if something comes back, especially if you have any sort of warranty applicable to the contract. Or in construction, there's usually timeline for, gosh, I am slow on the words today, any unforeseen defects. But we have that warranty period. Okay, so let's talk about, let me get back on task here. So let's talk about this completed contract files. So the next couple of slides kind of just talk about all of the material that you need. And again, we're going to see that we're going to have the list from the agency side and the contractor side as well. So in particular, file documentation must be sufficient to provide that complete background as to the basis for informed decision, support actions taken, provide information for reviews and investigations, and basically furnish essential facts in the event of a litigation. Now, if you've had a wonderful contract activity and you're thinking, oh, I don't need any of this stuff, um, developing a consistent contract practice where you are gathering and maintaining that in the event something should go pear-shaped, then you have that information and you're not scrambling to gather that after the fact. So the type of the content, the type of documents that we need, and we can see from the agency to the contractor. On the agency side, they start with the purchase request, which starts that acquisition planning cycle. For the contractor is that go, no go decision. And part of the value of having and maintaining these records is down the road, there be another cycle of this contract activity, or a contract is issued that's similar. Instead of having to rebuild everything from scratch, you have old contract files, old solicitation proposal files that you can pull and say, okay, what did we decide on that? How did we go about it? What was our starting activity and documentation? So that you can then further jumpstart your next activity of a similar nature. So under these documents, of course, that go, no go decision, a copy of the solicitation and all of the amendments, those proposal working papers. So the Excel spreadsheets, those subcontractor bids, your quotes, all the cost documentation, that technical narratives that you started pulling together, past performance narratives, those key personnel resumes, all of that information is worth maintaining and hanging on to while you're performing the contract. And then, of course, as part of that complete contract file, so that by the time you are in that closeout process, you already have the bulk of that information. And of course, that also includes any teaming documentation that may be applicable, those teaming agreements that then rolled into subcontract agreements. Of course, any JV documentation or mentor protege that was also involved for that contract activity. Once we get into award and performance, then this is again more of the documentation. And I'm not going to read over the agency side, but we're going to kind of just focus. I like having the comparison contrast because it gives you an idea of the information of what the agency, the contracting officer should be gathering and looking at and looking to ensure that they have for contract performance and award, because it gives you an idea of what that component for you on the contractor side. So when we're talking about award and performance for contract files, so again, sign contracts in any modifications. Post-award certification, such as TINA, the Truthful Cost and Pricing Data, or Truth in Negotiation Acts, if that is an applicable in a document you had to have signed, absolutely you should have a copy of that signed document in your contract files. Any of the bid, performance, or payment or other bond documents, insurance documentation where applicable, all required submittals, proof of filed required reports, and of course your subcontract, your subaward information, any teaming and subcontractor agreements, and your sub insurance certificate, sub business license, and any surety bonding as responsible, if applicable. So one thing just to call out when I say why you should have the insurance certificates, business license for any of your subcontractors, it's kind of one of those things, if nothing goes wrong, well, then nothing was really needed. But should there be a subcontractor that is injured or something has gone wrong on that contract performance, it becomes one of those potential liabilities. If that 1099 employee or that single owner small business subcontractor was working on site, working on your contract, and it turns out that they were not licensed or insured, well, technically, according to the Department of Labor, you didn't have a subcontractor. You had an employee that you now owe wages, back wages, and of course, medical and dental and all the other things that you should have been providing as possibly outlined in a wage determination. So having this information and making sure that your 1099 employees and those subcontractors truly are subcontractors, having that documentation and keeping that with your contract file is just a good risk management, as well as having that information for your contract closeout and completion. All right, continuing that list of files, we're going to gather any of that daily performance data, those field notebooks, any communication with the project between the project manager and the contracting officer representative, or any communication between the project manager or your business and that contract officer. And of course, those progress reports, status reports from subcontractors. Anything that you are adding to your package, adding to as part of that invoice and submittal documentation, make sure that you're gathering that information from all levels of that contract activity. Timesheets, especially in the world of construction where you need those certified timesheets, that certified payroll. Of course, any written communication from that representative, invoices, subcontractor invoices, and of course, any requests for equitable adjustment, and make sure that you have all of the supporting documentation, price verification, cost supporting documentation as well. So if we pause for a moment, and yeah, this is quite a laundry list of documents that you need to pull together, and the why of it, why do we want to take the time to gather all of this in place, especially if your contract has been smooth sailing and there really hasn't been anything that you've had to justify after the fact. Keep in mind on the agency side, the role of contract closeout can be done by your contracting officer that was there that had that contract administration through the life of the contract, but it might also fall on a contracting individual that's been assigned closeout duties that are coming in and they're looking at these contracts to do the official closeout a couple of years after the fact. And if they are going through this checklist of documentation and they are missing that information, there's a high possibility that they're going to reach out to you for any verification and request of information for proof of payment or closeout or any of those type of activities. And if you have that available, that's going to help move that process along a lot easier. If you have any areas where you're still negotiating or in discussions, such as before you send out your final payment and you're looking at change orders and that discussion, we'll use that term generously, of yes, those final payments really are, that additional cost really was incurred. We did the additional work as requested by the COR, and now we're trying to get paid for that additional work. I'm based on my experience here working with PTAC, and now of course our name changed with the Apex Accelerator. I've talked to several different small businesses that they're coming in and they're trying to close out contracts, and they're like, but they still owe us money. Yeah, we got a final invoice, but they didn't pay us for all of the additional work. And they're trying to now submit this last change order, last request saying, hey, I did additional work at the end of the project, and now I need to get paid for it before I can consider this contract closed. If you don't have this documentation to support all of that, who you talk to, the requests, if it was a verbal request, was it followed up with an email? That proof of, because it could be enough time has passed by that the individual, your COR, the individual that requested, is no longer even working for that agency. And now your proof of that being a valid cost is diminishing rapidly. So keep in mind that the value of knowing what the agency is requiring and kind of comparing it against what you are compiling for that completion of contract files, that's the justification. It's not for when everything is going smoothly, it's for that, oh, now we have a bit of a stumbling moment or a bit of a hiccup, or there is some potential for contention on the word of completion. All right, so moving on. Let's talk about the closeout procedures. So we defined when it's time to start the closeout process. The work's been done, the final invoice has been submitted and paid, and now we're gathering our documents. So the process itself. So this basic closeout principles, this really is right out of FAR guidance for contracting officers. And it talks about, reading is fundamental. Go through the entirety of your contract documentation to make sure that you understand the full activity. Is everything there? So for you as a contract administrator or the office manager, the individual that's looking at, is this contract fully closed out, having that final review. And again, what we're looking for is, has all costs and everything that's been required in the contract truly been completed and done? That inventory principle, going through, and again, is all of the documentation that is there in place? And by doing that final inventory, we're looking at, did we have security clearance? If that security clearance ends with that life of the contract, have all of the badging and documentation that you need been returned? If you have government property, do you have sign off that that's been returned? So, and again, we talk about that, the 3 different: reading is fundamental, the inventory, and that follow-up. So, and I'll leave this for you guys here to read. And follow-up, again, you can see really is that applicable when we're dealing with that cost plus type of contract. So areas of special concern. So when we are evaluating and reviewing, these are the type of things that we are looking for, the flags. The additional funding. 1, did you ask for a change order, request for equitable and REA, sorry, equitable adjustment. There we go. Let me get all the words out. And was there a delay because the agency had to go get more funds? And is that something that kind of just slipped through the cracks, where everybody just kept moving forward to get the contract completed? And now after the fact, they're like, oh yeah, what about this activity? Is the agency still trying to chase funds? Now, that can be a lot harder than it sounds for an agency to find funds. So if you had been performing a multi-year contract and we're trying to finalize the cost differential from an activity in option year 1, and now 5 years later you're like, oh yeah, well, you still owe us from this change at the beginning of the contract. Well, the contracting officer cannot necessarily pay you with current year monies. If that activity took place in your option year, they have to find funding from that pool of the year in which that action happened. So if you're in year 5, they got to go back and find that year 1 monies. And so that process isn't just as simple as reaching out to the end user and asking for those funds. It's a matter of running up that headquarter command and finding those funds and getting those funds released, or having that approval to use current year money for older year activities. So pay attention to that. If you are moving from option year to option year and you haven't resolved any cost differences from previous years, you want to stay on top of that. So this is one area when I had taken this contract closeout class with Management Concept, that the funding issues and finding those funds were, again, something we spent quite a bit of time talking about. Another area of concern is release claims. So for the government, they are supposed to have some sort of statement signed or of acceptance. Receipt of final payment indicates just that, acceptance that it truly is a final payment and that the federal government owes you no additional funds. So each agency has a different documentation or a different procedure that they use. So you might have seen that before, where some contracting officers ask you to sign a release. Some industries, such as construction, there's a more formalized process than others. Again, when we talk about those firm fixed price contracts or things purchased under that simplified acquisition process, it's just the assumption that it's complete, again, upon receipt of final and final payment. One of the things I want to pull out is I do have a little excerpt from a release of claims that kind of gives you an idea of the language that we're talking about. So if we think about it from our own contract management point of view, that if there is language in the federal government for the contracting officers to follow, do we want to have something similar that we are implementing in our contract practices when we're dealing with subcontractors? So again, having a subcontractor sign a release stating that, they have received final payment and completion of work, and also that you've accepted the entirety of their performance under that subcontract, so that there's not someone coming back to you after the fact saying, hey, we did additional work, and now you're trying to invoice that and roll that up after you have received that final payment as well. Okay, let me keep moving forward. Is there any questions? Just kind of checking through with everybody. All right. So areas of special concern continued, the disposition of classified information, and of course government provided identification such as base IDs, security clearances, etc. There we go, get the slides moving. Continuing that areas of special concern, invoice, liquidated, damaged, and final technical report. So the invoice contractor provided must be marked, stamped, otherwise indicated to be final invoice. Again, the electronic systems makes that really easy. There's that toggle, you've said yes or no, and a copy of the paid invoice should be included in the contract closeout file. And of course, if that's not available, then a certificate of final invoice was paid. So on the contracting side, especially if you do quite a few contract, you have, boy, me and words this morning, sorry about that. Let's talk electronic fund transfer. So on the agency side, if you have multiple contracts, it's very easy to have a deposit that is made up of payments for more than one contract. So part of that responsibility is ensuring that there is no overpayment or underpayment, and that you are separating out those funds and marking that as paid against the appropriate contracts. So if you have several contracts in play, and we're talking that, that penny differential of overpayment, you want to make sure that you have truly marked that EFT string, kept that information as proof of payment for that particular contract. So you might not have that, something as simple as a check that you can have a copy of, but track the EFT information and making sure that you are marking those invoices as paid. All right, liquidated damages, if applicable, and of course that final technical report must be completed, submitted, accepted. Patents and inventions, plant clearance reports, price revision completed, release of contract funds. So again, that release of contract fund is those de-obligations. So again, I'm not going to go into details of this because not all of it might be relevant, but if you pull those handouts, you'll have that information should down the road you do have a contract where suddenly you have plant or property and you need to go through that process, you have this information for future use. Royalty payments, subcontracts settled by subcontractor, and of course, subcontracting plan and revision. So let's talk about subcontract for a moment. There must be evidence that all subcontracts have been settled between the prime contractor and the subcontracts prior to the closeout at the government level. The same subjects that are addressed between government and the prime should be addressed between prime and its subcontractors. So this is one of those things that if there is some sort of discussion of equitable adjustment, change order from your subs, and you're saying, no, we've paid, you're good as far as you're concerned with your prime level, and the subcontractor reaches out to the agencies themselves, even though you have that privity of contract, it's not uncommon for a disgruntled subcontractor or a concerned subcontractor to reach out to the contracting officer. So part of that closeout process is to make sure that there is nothing in their records showing that. And again, you having a procedural process in play when you have contracts with subcontractors of obtaining releases, a signature saying, yep, we're happy, we received everything, and having that. So if someone from the agency is coming back a couple years later trying to close something out and they say, hey, we had this communication, we found this email in the contract file, was that resolved? You'll again have that documentation to show that everything is good. So while this sometimes seems far-fetched and far away, it's good to have continuous processes and thinking of all of these circumstances where this information might be critical to have. And then being consistent in your contract performance so that, again, when you come to this contract closeout process, the step, looking at the requirements for federal agencies and having that mirror in place, it's just a good contracting practice. All right, get off my soapbox there for a moment. And of course, the last couple areas I talk about are any value engineering changes and warranties. So these are all the areas identified and that contract closeout officers, if it's not the same as the contracting administrator, has to go through and verify that all of these things are in place and none of these areas of special concern were an issue for the performance of that contract. Okay, duplicate payments, we kind of talked about this again. Keep in mind, one of those clauses in your SAM profile, that whole 522097, that responsibility matters, part of that you're signing in SAM and with each contract is that duplicate payments and that responsibility to inform the government if they overpaid. Even if it is $1 or a penny, you have that responsibility. So again, when we talk about when you receive multiple payments under one lump EFT transaction, it is really important that you make sure that you as the contractor have done all your due diligence to report any, and then if that is the case, make sure you've documented it and documented the response of the agency as well as to how they're going to handle that overpayment. And those documents absolutely should be in your contract closeout file. Because again, you don't know when the agency is doing their paperwork to close that out and may come back to you with questions. All right, problem contract closeouts. So again, from that contracting officer perspective, there's these potential problems. So the contractor's no longer in business, contractors went through bankruptcy, or the contractor is unable to submit supporting indirect costs data, or if there was a change order, that request for equitable adjustment, and the players that were involved in that activity are simply no longer there. One business I worked with, their computer had crashed and they lost all their documentation. They didn't have any paper files, and he couldn't prove any of that actually happened. He couldn't provide that supporting documentation. So these type of things create a problem when the agency is trying to close out the contract. So for you, think of it as a subcontractor. Owed you additional, what if they go, if that subcontractor enters into bankruptcy or closes the doors, no longer in business. So these type of things are things that you should be looking at. We talk about it from the contracting officer's perspective of closing with the prime contractor, but these are things that are worth looking at for you when you're developing your process, and if you are in an industry where it's common for you to have subcontractors involved in your contract. The number one area that I hear from contracting officers all the time when they're trying to close out contracts is that the businesses fail to submit the final invoice. And I probably get 1 or 2 a month from the contracting officer. We work a lot with the Forest Service where that small business has moved on to their next contract and they're not submitting. And so you talk to the contractor and they're like, well, we're having problems with the invoicing process, or their SAM has expired. And so they've submitted, but the system won't let the invoice go through. So it is surprisingly, it's just amazing how often that final invoice doesn't get submitted. So for you all as good contract administrators, make sure that you're paying attention to that process. And if you're one of those individuals that wears multiple hats and multiple responsibilities within your company, make sure that those things are in place so that final invoice can be submitted and isn't becoming that problem closeout issue. Unreconcilable contracts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We're down to about 15 minutes, and I still have quite a bit of content to talk about. I'm going to leave this information for you for review down the road. So there are times where it just becomes that discrepancy on that final payment, final amounts, has become unreconcilable. There is that potential litigation. In that case, this is just information. And again, it's all from the contracting officer perspective, but there's good data here for you should that case be. And again, I'm going to leave that for you if needed down the road. Okay, contractor performance. So from a contractor perspective, we've done the work, we've received our funds, and now we need that past performance data. And completing that past performance information absolutely should be something that's not done at the end of the contract, but also done at the end of every option year. So if you do have multiple option years, you want to think about these little mini levels of contract closeout for that performance year, if not necessarily the entirety of the contract. So in past performance, and these are the areas that, and you can see identified in FAR 42, that should be addressed for a contracting officer to be able to issue past performance. Conforming to contract requirements and standards of good workmanship, forecasting control costs, adherence to contract schedules, reasonable cooperative behavior, commitment to customer satisfaction, reporting into databases. And don't forget that reporting into databases, that's a subcontractor reporting, but also just maintaining SAM, an active SAM profile. That is also contractor compliance through the life of a contract, is to not let your SAM expire. Integrity, business-like ethics, and of course, business-like concern for the interest of the customer. So all of these are things that the contracting officer should be looking at to complete their past performance at the end of the contract. So again, multiple years, there should be performance data for the completion of each option year, plus a final overall performance of the entirety of the contract. Now, the reason that it's good for you all to know that is often there's that opportunity to write up some of the highlights of your performance for that year and identify, potential issues that you were able to resolve and provide a narrative to the contracting officer so that they can then complete their contract performance information quicker. And we have workshops that we've done before with Randy Miller on doing your CPARs and making sure that you have a good CPAR record. And we're going to do that again this winter, so keep an eye out for that. But just to know that these are the type of things, again, part of that performance, not just doing the work and getting paid, but having that record of performance for future contracts. So those areas here that we discussed then are fed into to make that performance decision for your CPAR's grading scale. And that's that contractor past performance website, the cpars.gov. So performance evaluations contain both government and contractor comments to provide a balanced view of performance. So the contracting officer should be submitting that information to CPARS. The system should be then triggering and sending an email to the identified individual that's responsible for identifying the individual that has responsibility of replying and accepting comments, you establish that individual in your CPAR profile. Sorry, guys, I have a very upset dog whining behind me. That's very distracting. So again, past performance. Record retention requirements. So this next few slides really kind of go into quite a bit of detail of maintaining records for audit purposes. Now, I'm not going to read all of this to you. This is definitely worth having this slide and maintaining this, having this available, because it talks about the type of contracts, the documentation that you should have, and how long that you have to maintain these files should there be an audit, that you have this after the fact. So FAR 4.805 prescribes time periods for the retention of documents, and the table here sets forth the retention period requirement for various types of document. And the agencies do not need to keep closed contract files physically in the agency. So again, that also applies to you. You don't necessarily have to have it on your facility, but if you need to have some sort of retention method where that is retrievable. So if you turn everything to digital material, have offsite storage for that digital media, or again, offsite storage for those actual physical hard copy documents. Record retention by contractors. Although the primary focus is on the government concerning the retention of records, FAR does place some responsibility on the contractor in retention to certain records if the contract contains one of these following clauses. So again, sealed bidding negotiation, the 52215-2, if that's language is in your solicitation, even if it's in there by reference, that is going to give you the language that takes the you have to maintain these documents for this many years and applies it to your contracts. In contracts containing one of the clauses listed above, the FAR requires contractors to retain contract records and documents for 3 years after final payment, or as indicated in the table for specific records. So in some cases for payroll, you might have a longer time period. And again, we have more information for, this is for your use, record retention for contractor held records. All right, so let's talk about the contract closeout real quick from the contractor point of view, because I've talked a lot about comparison, contrasting from agency to contractor. But again, just to recap, contract is physically complete. We've met all of the compliance with terms, conditions, all legal matters resolved, the closeout documents have been initiated, they've been obtained, final settlement payment, and now we are consolidated our records and we're ready to pull all of that together. But keep in mind when we're looking at all of those documentation, and we had several slides that I really didn't go into in detail, the ones that are so critical that often are overlooked is make sure that you have those day-to-day activity logs, that communication, the emails for the performance, so that should there be something down the road where there's suddenly a warranty issue, you have that information at hand. From an accounting perspective for closing the book, so all your direct costs have been identified, and hold on one second. All right, your contract modifications have been identified from your supplier, vendors, subcontractors, employee labor. All financial disputes have been resolved. That final invoice has been submitted and paid. See it a theme? Yeah, we've talked about that one a lot. Subcontractor, vendors, suppliers paid in full, and of course all the lien releases, acceptance of final payment down that contracting hierarchy have all been resolved. So now that we have that data, we can take a moment and look internally at our contract performance. So we have our submittal documents, our proposed pricing, and now that the contract is closed, we have our actuals and we can do a comparison. how did you do for your performance differential? So just looking at it from a cost perspective, what you proposed versus what was actually spent, how did you do? Were there areas that were just unforeseen, that were acceptable within the contract performance, or were there areas that you neglected when you pulled your proposal together that you want to make sure that you apply that learned moment to future proposal activities? So when you're looking at both your self-performance and subcontractor performance as well. So we talked about looking at that performance and having that performance evaluated by the agency. If you have subcontractors, that's worth taking a moment to look at how happy were you with the performance of those subcontractors? Do you want to use them again, both from the on the site, the actual performance, but how were they from that paperwork? Were they submitting invoices on time? Is their communication sufficient and timely? Those things that the agencies are going to be looking at, did you do that as well? So not only are we looking at proposed versus actual costs, but at your timeline, proposed versus actual as well. How did that fall into? Were there delays that weren't just, government caused by the government, or we had another record-breaking snowfall or government shutdown, but things that were actually triggered by either performance, self-performance, or subcontract performance. And how can those be either built in as a contingency item for future proposals, or how can they be avoided for future performance? Those lessons learned. This whole slide is really about taking those lessons learned from work we've just completed and looking at our internal processes and seeing, should we be making changes to how we do business so that we don't have these same issues in future contracts. So safety performance, employee performance, looking at that performance throughout all the tiers. And again, what lessons have we learned? What do we want to address? Is this something that we need to then implement as new processes to not have these same problems from contract to contract? So archiving narratives. Why reinvent the wheel for each new proposal? Instead, develop a proposal archiving system to capture. So yeah, you have your final documents that you submitted, and hopefully you kept a copy of your proposal so that you can have that for reference while actually completing that contract. But you want to look at the things that you took the time to build and the various versions of for those technical narratives, those key personnel resumes, and past performance packages. Because most likely you can use the backbone of this data for future solicitations. You don't necessarily want to just use the same language for everything. It needs to be tailored for specific. But instead of trying to remember, especially if you had really great phrasing, things that went well for you for award, you want to make sure you have that concept, that language for future contacts, which means it needs to be accessible. So developing a way to archive your data so that it is accessible for future activity. Compare proposed against actual and adjust the narrative for future use. So if we did find things here that we had some lessons learned, how can that be applied and captured so that when we're doing future narratives, that is incorporated? If the proposal was an award, request a debrief. So if we went through and we gathered that and you weren't the awardee, again, request a debrief. Again, compare the feedback against the narratives and adjust, add comments, or improve for future use. Track the narratives that worked well, had positive feedback, and mirrored actual performance. So we might have had an anticipated of how the technical was going to happen, and then the reality varied enough that we want to, again, mark proposed versus actual and adjust accordingly. And then develop a keyword system for tagging portions of these narratives in order to find for future use. So let's talk about relationship maintenance. So I've got just a couple more slides. This is the last subject matter slide that I want to talk about, and then the rest is just contact information. So how did your project relationship end? So we talked about, yes, the federal government has to provide those performance evaluations. That information, if you hit the right threshold, should be entered into CPARs. But how did you do? Getting that information, so even if you had a contract that was completed and it was under the dollar threshold, so it doesn't require a formal performance evaluation to be entered into CPARs, you can still request a written evaluation for performance from the contracting officer. So when we say hear from owner, whether government, even to roll this into your commercial practice as well, because this past performance on those commercial contracts are applicable for past performance against future federal contracts. So keep that in mind. So from owner, primes, and subs, how did you do? Whether you're looking for written documentation to use as you guys are a good contractor, you can do the work, but just to monitor your own client satisfaction for your company performance. Your teaming partners, how did they perform? Are they someone you want to continue that business relationship with? In the discussions for future projects, how will you continue this relationship? So if this is a first contract with a particular federal agency, or even in the federal agency you might have experience with, but a new location, and you want to keep those opportunities open, how can you maintain that relationship? What is your follow-up practice to ensure that you maintain that and are remembered for the next projects along the line? Of course, getting those written performance evaluations are critical, but it's really about following up and maintaining that business relationship as well. You can do that satisfaction survey, a year after completion. Hey, we just following up a year later, how did we do? That refresh that contracting officer or even that commercial to maintain that feedback. Status check with lenders, financial institutions, your surety providers, your suppliers, your vendors. Just how is the business relation? How did that work throughout that contract performance as well? And again, how is that going to benefit you for that next contract activity? So not as only performance, but again, it's that maintaining those relationships with all of those factors of subs, vendors, suppliers, owner. How all did that work, and maintaining that positive relationship so that they keep you in mind for those next opportunities. So that was a lot of information to go through. And we're kind of at our 1 hour marker, and I rolled through a lot of information fairly quickly. Does anyone have any questions, any comments, any experience with contract closeout? All right. Well, just let me take a moment, since we did change our name from Alaska PTAC to Alaska Apex Accelerator. I usually was doing this at the beginning, but it was causing me to run out of time. So the one thing that I want to point out about our program is just right here, that if you are expanding your business, moving into different geographic areas, feel free to check out the other PTAC Apex accelerators across the USA, Puerto Rico and Guam as well. I just found out yesterday that we're now up to 97 programs under the association. And if you're looking for offices, you can go to the aptac-us.org or the DoD site, the apexaccelerator.us. On those landing pages, you can click on that, you can click on the state link, and you can find out where are those PTACs. As we all specialize in federal contracting, we're each experts on the contracting for that state and local activity. So it's good as you're expanding your business into different geographic regions, reach out to those other PTACs as well, or Apex accelerators. And then last but not least, if you are like me and you're absorbing all this new knowledge and the brain is, partitioning it away, and now that everything's closed, now I have all my questions. Happens to me every time. Think about it and all the questions I wish I would have asked, but didn't think of until after the fact. here is how to reach out to the staff at Alaska Apex Accelerator. If you have questions or would like to schedule appointments with us, please contact us. You have our email address, direct phone lines, and of course we have our general email, the info@apexalaska.org. But reach out to us, let us know how we can help you, whether with the contract closeout process or other contracting issues. We're here to provide that assistance with you, or for you, to work with you. There we go. Let me get my prepositions all lined up correctly. Well, we are at our hour marker. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'm going to do a last call for questions. And while you're thinking of that, don't forget to download those handouts. I'll give you that full page copy of all the slides. If you're unable to download the handouts, you can always just reply to your webinar invitation and request that I send that to you, and I'll be happy to get that out to you. And as a last reminder, the recording should be posted by Monday on the PTAC Alaska, see, I'm still doing our old, on the alaskaapex.org website under the training events under on demand. Thanks, Sherry, I appreciate the comment. All right, everyone. Well, I'm going to go ahead and officially close today's webinar.